The last transmission from the Kepler defense station crackled through space, like the dying breath of hope itself. Admiral Lysander Wren stood before the holographic display in the command center of Terran Station Alpha, watching red markers blink out of existence one by one across the star map. Each disappearing light represented 1,000 lives, another strategic position lost to the advancing Kythera Dominion fleet. "Sir, long-range sensors confirm it," reported Lieutenant Nessa Corwin, her voice barely steady. "The entire outer rim defense grid has fallen. The Kythera will reach the core worlds within 72 hours. Wren's weathered hands clenched behind his back as he studied the tactical display. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Defense Coalition for only 3 decades, barely long enough to be considered more than a probationary member. While species like the technologically advanced Veilthons contributed gleaming plasma cruisers and the warrior Drachmoth brought their legendary battle fortresses, Earth's contribution had been modest. A handful of aging patrol vessels, outdated interceptors that other races had long since relegated to scrap yards, and pilots who flew with more heart than sense. "What's our current fleet status?" Wren asked, though he already knew the answer would taste like ashes. 12 functional starfighters from the reserve depot, sir. The last of the F-47 Thunderhawks we purchased from the Centaurian surplus auction. Most are held together with salvaged parts and stubborn determination. Corwin paused, then added quietly, "The Coalition High Command has declined to provide additional support. They're consolidating their forces to defend the primary systems." The translation was clear enough. Humanity was expendable. Their outdated fighters and undertrained pilots weren't worth the resources it would take to properly equip them. Better to let the humans make their stand with their obsolete machines while the real militaries prepared for the final defense. In the pilot-ready room 3 decks below, Commander Thessavalin addressed the dozen men and women who represented Earth's last hope. The assembled pilots looked young, far too young for what was coming. Most had fewer than 50 combat hours in actual operations, their training conducted in simulators and safe patrol routes far from any real danger. "The situation is what it is," Valen said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had made her legendary among human pilots. "The Kythera Advance Fleet will arrive in 16 hours. Intelligence suggests they're bringing everything they have: dreadnoughts, assault carriers, fighter wings that outnumber us 100 to 1. Pilot Kalen Drexus raised his hand, a gesture that would have been laughable in any other military context but somehow felt appropriate here. "Commander, with respect, how exactly are we supposed to stop an armada with 12 fighters that were obsolete when our grandparents were born?" Valen smiled, and for a moment the weight of impending doom lifted from the room. "Because, Drexus, there's something about humans that the rest of the galaxy hasn't figured out yet. We don't just use our equipment, we make it better. We adapt, we innovate, and we refuse to accept that impossible means anything more than difficult." She activated the holographic display showing the specifications of their F-47 Thunderhawks. The fighters were boxy, utilitarian craft with none of the elegant curves of Veilthon design or the imposing bulk of Drachmoth engineering. They looked exactly like what they were, ships built by a species that had learned to fight in the vacuum of space through trial, error, and an alarming willingness to try things that no sane engineer would approve. "These ships weren't designed to be the best," Valen continued. "They were designed to be modifiable, reparable, and adaptable. Every system can be overridden, every component can be jury-rigged, and every limitation can be turned into an advantage if you're clever enough." Outside the station, the F-47 Thunderhawks sat in their launch bays like sleeping predators. Their hulls bore the scars of a dozen battles, patches of armor welded over battle damage, and modifications that would void the warranty of any self-respecting manufacturer. But in the hands of human pilots who had grown up watching old war movies and reading tales of impossible victories, they were about to become something the galaxy had never seen before. The countdown to the Kythera arrival had begun, and with it, humanity's chance to prove that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the best equipment, it's the one with nothing left to lose. The maintenance bay hummed with activity as Kalen Drexus ran his hands along the scarred hull of his F-47, designation Broken Promise. Chief Technician Yorick Blackthorn emerged from beneath the fighter's belly, his face streaked with grease and his expression grim. "The good news is she'll fly," Blackthorne announced, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. "The bad news is everything else. Port thruster is running at 60% efficiency, the targeting computer has a 2-second delay, and the primary weapons array draws so much power it'll drain your shields if you fire for more than 30 seconds straight." Drexus nodded absently, his mind already working through possibilities. This was the human way, not lamenting what you didn't have, but figuring out how to make what you did have work better than it was supposed to. "What about the modifications Commander Valen approved?" "Ah, now that's where it gets interesting." Blackthorne's weathered face split into a grin that would have worried a sane person. "We've been busy, lad. Very busy indeed." He led Drexus around to the fighter's rear section, where additional fuel tanks had been welded to the frame with the kind of precision that suggested either genius or complete madness. Extended range modification, courtesy of some Drachmoth auxiliary tank designs and a complete disregard for manufacturer specifications. "You'll have 3 times normal flight duration, assuming the extra weight doesn't tear the wings off during atmospheric entry. And if it does? Well, then you'll have a very brief but spectacular career as a meteor." Across the bay, other pilots were discovering their own modifications. Mira Kithrin stood beside her fighter, Widow's Vengeance, examining what appeared to be additional sensor arrays cobbled together for mining equipment and communication relays. The resulting monstrosity looked like it had been assembled by someone who had seen a proper reconnaissance package described secondhand and decided to improve upon it using spare parts and wishful thinking. "The resolution isn't exactly military grade," Chief Blackthorne explained to her, "but you'll be able to see things coming from twice the normal range. Might give you a few extra seconds to react when the shooting starts." Jorik Ashfeld, whose fighter bore the ominous name Last Resort, was examining what appeared to be armor plating torn from a decommissioned cargo hauler and welded to his ship's frame. The modification made his F-47 look less like a sleek interceptor and more like a flying anvil. "She won't win any beauty contests," Blackthorne admitted, "but she'll take hits that would vaporize a stock fighter. Course, the extra weight means you'll handle like a drunk asteroid, but that's what skill is for, right?" Commander Valen appeared at Drexus's shoulder, her own flight suit already zipped and ready. Her fighter, Defiant Thunder, bore modifications that defied easy categorization, additional weapon hardpoints that had never appeared in any manual, shield generators that had been cross-wired with the life support systems, and thruster assemblies that looked like they belonged on a ship 3 times larger. "The Coalition's latest intelligence report came in," she said without preamble. "The Kythera advance fleet is larger than expected. 47 capital ships, including 3 of the new Void Render-class dreadnoughts, supported by over 300 fighter craft. Davin Carell, the youngest pilot in the squadron at barely 19 standard years, let out a low whistle. "So we're outnumbered roughly 600 to 1. Those are almost fair odds." Valen smiled at the young man's bravado, but Drexus could see the weight of command in her eyes. She knew what everyone else was trying not to think about: this wasn't a mission with a high probability of survival. This was humanity's last stand, fought with equipment that should have been scrapped years ago by pilots who had barely finished their training. "There's something else," Valen continued. "The Kythera have been monitoring Coalition communications. They know our force composition, our defensive positions, and our tactical doctrines. They're not expecting any surprises from the human contingent." "That," said Drexus, running his hand along a jury-rigged weapon mount, "might be the first advantage we've had." The hangar's warning lights began to flash amber, indicating 6 hours until the enemy's projected arrival. Around them, the controlled chaos of final preparations continued. Ammunition was loaded into guns that had been modified to fire rounds they weren't designed for. Fuel tanks were topped off with mixtures that would void every safety protocol ever written. Systems were cross-connected in ways that would horrify any engineer who understood what they were seeing. But in the hands of humans who had learned to fly by watching ancient footage of atmospheric fighters dancing through clouds of flak, who had studied tactics from wars fought with chemical explosives and kinetic projectiles, these modifications weren't just jury-rigged repairs. They were innovations born from desperation and refined by the kind of stubborn creativity that had taken humanity from ground-bound mammals to starfaring warriors in less than a century. As the pilots dispersed to complete their individual preparations, Drexus paused beside his fighter one last time. Broken Promise might not be the most advanced starfighter in the galaxy, but she was his. And in a few hours, she would carry him into a battle that would determine whether humanity earned its place among the stars or became another cautionary tale whispered in the archives of fallen civilizations. The Kythera Advance Fleet dropped out of hyperspace like a plague of metal locusts, their ships emerging from the void in perfect formation. From his position at the edge of the asteroid field designated Navigation Point Tango, Kalen Drexus watched through his modified sensors as the enemy armada deployed across the approaches to Terran Station Alpha. "Holy stars," whispered Mira Kithrin over the comm, her voice tight with controlled fear. Intelligence was wrong. "That's not 47 ships, I'm counting at least 60 capital vessels." Commander Valen's voice cut through the growing chatter with calm precision. "All call signs, maintain calm discipline. Widow's Vengeance, confirmed count on enemy force composition." Drexus activated his fighter's enhanced sensor package, the cobbled-together array humming with power that should have been impossible for a ship this size. The modification had cost him nearly half his weapon's capacity, but as the detailed tactical picture resolved on his display, he understood why Valen had approved the trade-off. "Broken Promise confirms 63 capital ships," he reported. 3 Void Render-class dreadnoughts in the center formation, surrounded by heavy cruisers in a standard Kythera battlesphere deployment. Fighter screen is significant. "I'm tracking over 400 individual craft." The numbers should have been paralyzing. 12 human fighters against an armada that could glass a planet. But as Drexus watched the enemy formation, he began to notice something that their intelligence briefings had mentioned but never emphasized. The Kythera flew with mathematical precision, perfect formations, textbook deployments, and tactical doctrines that had been refined over centuries of conquest. They were predictable. "Squadron, this is Thunder Lead," Valen's voice carried a note that made Drexus sit up straighter. "Execute Fury Protocol on my mark. Remember, we're not trying to win a fair fight, we're trying to survive long enough to make them rethink what fair means." The Fury Protocol was pure human insanity disguised as tactics. Instead of engaging the enemy fleet in traditional formation combat, the human fighters would scatter across the system like debris from a destroyed ship, each operating independently with no central coordination. To any rational military doctrine, it would appear to be either a desperate rout or complete tactical breakdown. Which was exactly the point. "Thunder Lead, this is last resort," Jorik Ashfeld's voice crackled through the comm. "I've got multiple enemy fighter squadrons moving to intercept Station Alpha's defense platforms. Permission to provide discouragement? Granted, last resort. Make it count." Drexus watched as Ashfeld's heavily armored fighter broke from concealment behind a mining platform, moving with the ponderous determination of an avalanche. The Kythera fighters were sleek, agile craft designed for precision strikes against military targets. They weren't prepared for a flying battering ram that shrugged off their energy weapons and returned fire with kinetic projectiles that had been designed for mining operations. The first Kythera squadron scattered as last resort plowed through their formation. Ashfeld's modified weapons erased sending streams of high-velocity metal into ships that had never been designed to withstand such primitive but effective firepower. 3 enemy fighters simply disintegrated under the assault, their advanced armor useless against weapons that operated on principles older than their civilization. "Widow's Vengeance to all call signs," Myra's voice carried excitement despite the odds. "Enemy command frequency is wide open, they're using unencrypted communications. I'm hearing complete confusion about our tactical deployment. Recommend we keep them guessing." Drexus smiled grimly as he fired up Broken Promise's modified engines, feeling the extra fuel tanks shift the fighter's balance in ways that should have made her unflyable. But human pilots had learned to fly things that shouldn't work, atmospheric craft held together with determination, spacecraft that exceeded every safety margin, and now starfighters that had been rebuilt according to principles that no sane engineer would approve. "Thunder Lead, this is Broken Promise. Beginning harassment run on enemy battlesphere. If this works, I'll owe Chief Blackthorn a drink. If it doesn't, well, the bar tab won't matter." He engaged the fighter's stealth systems, another modification that existed primarily in the overlap between advanced technology and wishful thinking, and began his approach toward the Kythera capital ships. The enemy formation was designed to repel coordinated attacks by conventional forces. It wasn't designed to handle a single fighter approaching from an impossible angle at speeds that should have torn the ship apart. Broken Promise screamed through space on a trajectory that would have given any flight instructor nightmares, her modified engines straining against loads they had never been designed to handle. But as Drexus closed on the enemy dreadnought, he felt the familiar surge of something that no amount of technology could replicate, the utterly human conviction that impossible simply meant no one had tried hard enough yet. The real battle was about to begin, and for the first time since the war started, the Kythera were about to learn why humans had earned their reputation as the galaxy's most stubborn survivors. The first Kythera dreadnought, Eternal Dominance, had never been fired upon by anything smaller than a heavy cruiser. Its shields were rated to deflect capital ship weaponry, its armor designed to withstand sustained bombardment from fleet formations. What it was not prepared for was Kalen Drexus diving toward its command tower at speeds that bent the definition of sanity, firing weapons that had never appeared in any tactical manual. Broken Promise to all call signs, Drexus transmitted as he pulled out of his attack run. The mining charges work exactly as advertised. Recommend immediate implementation of Operation Junkyard. Behind him, a section of the dreadnought's superstructure erupted in a cascade of secondary explosions as the industrial mining charges he'd fired into the ship's shield generators overloaded systems that had never been designed to handle such crude but effective weaponry. The Kythera had built their ships to withstand elegant energy weapons and sophisticated plasma cannons. They hadn't considered the devastating simplicity of explosives designed to crack asteroids. Commander Valen's voice crackled over the comm with barely suppressed satisfaction. All call signs, confirmed effectiveness of alternative munitions. Davin, you're clear for your package delivery. Young Davin Carell's fighter, Starfall Requiem, emerged from the shadow of a space station's debris field like a mechanical ghost. His F-47 had been stripped down to the bare essentials and loaded with a cargo that would have horrified any safety inspector in the galaxy, 4 tons of industrial welding charges connected to a detonation system that Chief Blackthorne had described as enthusiastically experimental. This is Requiem. Davin's voice carried the steady calm of someone too young to properly understand the odds he was facing. Beginning kamikaze approach on enemy battlesphere center. If anyone wants to say something profound about sacrifice and heroism, now would be the time. Stow that talk, Carell, Valen snapped. You're not dying today. Execute Plan Magnificent Bastard and get clear before those charges cook off. Plan Magnificent Bastard was another piece of human tactical insanity. Instead of flying his explosive-laden fighter into the enemy formation as a suicide weapon, Davin would use the F-47's modified escape pod system to launch the entire cargo bay toward the target while he ejected in the opposite direction. It was the kind of plan that could only work once, and only if the enemy had never encountered anything like it before. Which, fortunately, they hadn't. The Kythera fighter screen moved to intercept what appeared to be a desperate kamikaze attack, their energy weapons focusing fire on Starfall Requiem as she dove toward their command ship. They scored multiple hits, but the fighter's jury-rigged armor held long enough for Davin to reach the optimal release point. Package away, he transmitted, ejecting from his disintegrating fighter in an escape pod that had been modified with additional thrusters and stealth plating. Delivery in 30 seconds, suggest everyone find some cover. The cargo container tumbled through space toward the center of the Kythera battle formation, looking for all the world-like debris from the destroyed fighter. The enemy ships ignored it, focusing their attention on the escape pod and the other human fighters that were conducting what appeared to be random, uncoordinated attacks throughout the system. They were still ignoring it when 4 tons of industrial explosives detonated in the middle of their formation. The explosion was visible from 3 star systems away, a brief sun that painted the void in shades of destruction. When the light faded, the center of the Kythera battlesphere simply wasn't there anymore. 2 heavy cruisers had been vaporized entirely, and the flagship itself listed helplessly with half its superstructure blown away. Sweet merciful stars, whispered Jorik Ashfeld. Did we just actually hurt them? Negative, last resort, Valen's voice carried grim satisfaction. We didn't hurt them. We pissed them off. All call signs, prepare for phase 2. They're about to stop treating us like an annoyance and start treating us like a threat. Across the system, the Kythera fleet was already adapting to the human tactics. Fighter squadrons that had been operating in textbook formations were spreading out into wider patrol patterns. Capital ships were rotating their shields to cover approach vectors that no sane pilot would attempt. Communication frequencies that had been open were suddenly encrypted and protected. But adaptation took time, and humans had spent centuries learning to think faster than their enemies could react. Widow's vengeance to Thunder Lead, Myra's voice carried excitement. I'm tracking massive enemy communications traffic. They're trying to coordinate a response to tactics they've never seen before. Request permission to introduce them to human electronic warfare doctrine. Granted, Widow. Show them what happens when you give a human access to enemy communications. Myra's fighter had been equipped with communication arrays that were, strictly speaking, completely illegal under 17 different interstellar treaties. They could intercept, decode, and retransmit enemy communications with modifications that ranged from subtle tactical misdirection to complete chaos. Within minutes, Kythera squadron commanders were receiving contradictory orders, navigation computers were being fed false position data, and the enemy's vaunted coordination was beginning to fracture under the assault of what humans cheerfully called creative signal interpretation. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the war began, the Kythera were reacting to human initiatives instead of dictating the terms of engagement. And in the cold mathematics of warfare, that represented a victory more significant than any single destroyed ship. Admiral Zyxthera the Void Render stood before the tactical display aboard his flagship, watching red markers represent his fleet scatter across the hologram like leaves in a storm. In 3 centuries of conquest, he had never seen anything like the chaos these primitive humans were creating with their obsolete fighters and impossible tactics. Report, he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a being who had reduced star systems to ash. Sir, we've lost 17 ships to 12 enemy fighters, his tactical officer reported, unable to hide the disbelief in his voice. They're using weapons and tactics that don't appear in any database. Industrial explosives, mining charges, communication warfare, and flight patterns that violate basic principles of physics. Zyxthera studied the display with growing interest rather than alarm. The humans were proving more resourceful than intelligence had suggested, but resourcefulness without overwhelming force was merely a delay tactic. Adjust formations. Deploy the reserve fighter squadrons and authorize the use of planetary bombardment protocols. Sir, that will destroy the space station and any human survivors. Acceptable losses. These humans have proven they cannot be allowed to develop their tactical innovations further. But even as the Kythera adapted their strategy, the human pilots were evolving their own approach. Commander Thessalon had studied every recorded battle in human history, from ancient naval engagements fought with wooden ships to the first orbital conflicts of Earth's space age. She understood something that the Kythera, for all their technological superiority, had never grasped, that desperate enemies with nothing to lose were the most dangerous opponents in the universe. All call signs, this is Thunder Lead, she transmitted to her scattered squadron. Enemy is deploying reserve forces and moving to bombardment positions. Execute Protocol Forlorn Hope on my command. Protocol Forlorn Hope was the last desperate gambit in the human tactical manual, a coordinated attack on the enemy command structure that would require every remaining fighter to penetrate the heart of the Kythera formation. It was called a Forlorn Hope because historically, such attacks had survival rates measured in single digits. But as Valen pushed Defiant Thunder to maximum burn toward the enemy flagship, she wasn't thinking about survival rates. She was thinking about the message they would send to the galaxy, that humanity would not go quietly into extinction, that Earth's children would make their enemies pay for every light year of conquered space. Thunder Lead, this is Broken Promise. Kalen Drexus's voice crackled through the comm. My fuel reserves are running low, but I've got one more run in me. Permission to demonstrate the finer points of human aerospace engineering? Granted, Broken Promise. Show them how we build things to last. Drexus had been saving his most desperate modification for this moment. Chief Blackthorn had installed a secondary fuel system that could be overloaded to provide massive thrust at the cost of completely destroying the fighter's engines. It was a one-way ticket to either victory or a very spectacular death. He engaged the overload system and felt Broken Promise surge forward with acceleration that should have liquefied his internal organs. The fighter's frame groaned under stresses it had never been designed to handle, but she held together through a combination of superior human engineering and sheer bloody-minded determination. Behind him, the rest of the squadron followed in a ragged formation that looked more like a controlled explosion than a military maneuver. Myra's sensor-heavy fighter provided targeting data while jamming enemy communications. Jorik's armored battering ram carved a path through enemy interceptors. The surviving pilots pushed their modified fighters beyond every safety limit, trusting in human engineering and the kind of stubborn courage that had taken their species from caves to the stars. The Kythera defensive fire was overwhelming, energy beams that could vaporize mountains filling space around the approaching human fighters. But the F-47s had been built by a species that understood that if something was worth doing, it was worth overdoing spectacularly. Last resort taking heavy fire, Jorik reported, his voice strained but steady. Armor's holding, but I'm losing maneuverability. Requesting permission to provide close-range technical consultation to the enemy flagship. Negative, last resort. We need you mobile for. With respect, Commander, I'm not going to be mobile much longer anyway. Might as well make it count. Before Valen could respond, Jorik's heavily modified fighter broke from formation and dove toward the nearest Kythera cruiser. But instead of attempting to ram the enemy ship, he activated his fighter's emergency beacon and ejected, leaving last resort to hurtle toward the target on autopilot. The Kythera, recognizing a kamikaze attack, focused their defensive fire on the approaching fighter. They destroyed it 3 kilometers from impact, turning the F-47 into an expanding cloud of debris that posed no threat to their armored hull. Which was exactly what Jorik had been counting on. The debris included 17 modified mining charges with proximity detonators, scattering across the cruiser's hull before exploding in a sequence that Chief Blackthorn had carefully calculated to maximize structural damage. The enemy ship didn't explode, it simply came apart, its superstructure folding in on itself as critical support members failed in cascade. Magnificent work, last resort, Valen transmitted to Jorik's escape pod. All remaining call signs, weapons free on the flagship. Let's finish this. The command bridge of ZY-Xtera's flagship had become a monument to controlled chaos as damage reports flooded in from across the fleet. The tactical display showed a picture that defied every principle of warfare the Kythera had mastered over centuries of conquest. 12 primitive fighters had reduced the battle fleet to a fraction of its original strength using tactics that ranged from brilliant to completely insane. Sir, recommend immediate withdrawal, the tactical officer urged. We've underestimated human capabilities by several orders of magnitude. ZY-Xtera's 4 eyes fixed on the display showing the remaining human fighters closing on his position. The primitive vessels should have been destroyed minutes ago, their pilots vaporized by weapons that could crack planets. Instead, they flew onward with the relentless determination of natural forces, their damaged hulls held together by modifications that violated every known principle of engineering. No, he said quietly. Deploy all remaining reserves. If these humans want to die gloriously, we shall accommodate them. But even as he gave the order, ZY-Xtera understood that something fundamental had changed. For the first time in his long career of conquest, he was not fighting an enemy, he was fighting an idea. The idea that desperation could triumph over superior force, that courage could overcome technology, and that sometimes the galaxy's most dangerous opponents were the ones with nothing left to lose. Commander Valen felt defiant thunder shudder as enemy fire found its mark, systems failing in cascade across her modified fighter. But the ship held together, its jury-rigged components functioning far beyond their design specifications through a combination of superior human engineering and the kind of willful determination that had built civilizations from scratch. Thunder lead to all call signs, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the growing list of system failures. Final approach on enemy flagship. Remember, we're not just fighting for Earth, we're fighting for every species in the galaxy that's been told they're not good enough, not advanced enough, not worth defending. Kalen Drexus felt his fuel reserves hit critical levels as Broken Promise screamed through the Kythera defensive fire. His fighter's frame was stressed beyond any reasonable limit, held together by welds that should have failed hours ago and powered by systems that existed in open defiance of manufacturer specifications. Broken Promise to Thunder lead, he reported. I'm reading massive energy buildup in the enemy flagship's main weapon. Whatever they're planning, it's going to be big. Copy that, Broken Promise. All call signs, execute final phase. Show them what humans call overkill. The remaining F-47s dove toward ZYX's flagship in a formation that looked more like barely controlled meteors than military aircraft. Their weapons had been exhausted long ago, their missiles expended, their energy reserves nearly depleted. But each fighter carried one final modification that Chief Blackthorne had installed with the grim satisfaction of an engineer who understood that sometimes the best way to solve a problem was to explode it thoroughly. Each F-47's reactor could be overloaded to create an antimatter cascade that would turn the entire fighter into a weapon more powerful than any missile. It was a one-way option, requiring the pilot to eject at precisely the right moment to avoid being vaporized along with their ship. "This is Widow's vengeance," Mira transmitted. "Reactor overload initiated. Someone better remember to put this in the history books. Starfall Requiem, overload confirmed. If we pull this off, the drinks are on me for the next century. Defiant Thunder, initiating final protocol. It's been an honor flying with you all." One by one, the human fighters began their final transformation from vehicles into weapons, their reactors building toward critical mass as their pilots prepared for the most precisely timed ejection sequence in military history. The Kythera defensive fire intensified, energy beams that could boil oceans filling space around the approaching fighters. But the F-47 Thunderhawks had been built by humans, who understood that sometimes the most important engineering specification was keeps working when everything goes wrong. The fighters held together through damage that should have destroyed them, their pilots nursing wounded machines through a final approach that would determine the fate of not just Earth, but every world that dared to resist the Kythera advance. "All call signs, this is Thunder Lead," Valen's voice carried across the comm with the quiet authority of someone who had led her people as far as courage could take them. "Ejection sequence in 3, 2, 1. Execute!" 6 escape pods erupted from the approaching fighters as their pilots ejected at the last possible moment, trusting in mathematics, timing, and the kind of engineering precision that had taken humanity from ground-bound animals to star-traveling warriors. Behind them, 6 F-47 Thunderhawks continued their final flight, no longer piloted vehicles but instruments of destruction carrying the hopes and fury of an entire species. The antimatter cascades began milliseconds apart, turning obsolete starfighters into brief suns that painted the void in humanity's defiant answer to conquest. The silence that followed the explosions seemed to stretch across the entire galaxy. Where ZYX's flagship had dominated space with its imposing bulk, only expanding clouds of superheated plasma marked its passage. The Kythera advance fleet, reduced to scattered survivors fleeing in disorder, transmitted their retreat across hyperspace frequencies that carried a message more profound than any military defeat. Earth's children would not be conquered easily. Commander Thessavalin floated in her escape pod, watching the tactical display show enemy ships jumping to hyperspace in 1s and 2s, their perfect formations shattered beyond repair. Around her, 5 other pods drifted in the void, the last survivors of humanity's most desperate gambit. "All call signs, sound off," she transmitted, her voice hoarse from breathing recycled air and adrenaline. "Broken promise here," Kalen Drexus replied. "Pod systems functional, pilot mostly intact." "Did we actually win that?" Widow's Vengeance reporting, Myra's voice carried exhausted satisfaction. "Enemy fleet is in full retreat. I'm reading massive communications traffic, they're calling this a strategic withdrawal, but it sounds more like panic." One by one, the surviving pilots reported in. 6 escape pods containing 6 humans who had turned 12 obsolete fighters into a victory that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of warfare itself. But even as rescue ships from Terran Station Alpha moved to collect them, Valen felt the weight of what their victory had cost. Jorik Ashfeld's pod had been damaged during ejection, his life support was failing, and the rescue ships were still 20 minutes away. Davin Carell's pod had taken shrapnel from his fighter's destruction, his beacon transmitting medical alerts that painted a grim picture of his chances. "Thunder Lead, this is Rescue 1, came the voice of the recovery team leader. "We're tracking multiple pod signatures, but some are showing critical system failures. Medical teams are standing by." Valen closed her eyes, feeling the familiar ache that came with command decisions made in desperate circumstances. They had won an impossible victory, proven that human ingenuity could triumph over overwhelming odds, and sent a message that would echo across the galaxy for generations. But victory always had a price. Hours later, Admiral Lysander Wren stood in the medical bay of Terran Station Alpha, looking down at the beds containing what remained of humanity's finest pilots. Jorik Ashfeld had been saved, barely, his rescue pod recovered with minutes to spare. Davin Carell would fly again, eventually, after months of recovery from injuries that would have killed anyone with less determination to live. The initial reports are difficult to believe, Wren said to Valen, who was refusing medical treatment despite burns from her pod's failing life support. Galactic Defense Coalition is calling it the Battle of Impossible Odds. Every major news service in the galaxy is trying to interview our pilots. Valen managed a tired smile. And what are we telling them? The truth. That 12 humans and obsolete fighters defeated a Kythera advance fleet using tactics that violate every principle of conventional warfare. Wren paused, studying the tactical after-action reports. There's something else. Intelligence intercepts suggest the Kythera have suspended their advance toward the core worlds. They're requesting negotiations. They want to talk? They want to understand how we did it. How 12 fighters accomplished what 3 coalition battle fleets couldn't manage. Wren's expression was grim. The galaxy is going to be asking the same question. Across the system, in the salvage fields where the battle had been fought, recovery teams worked to catalog the debris from the destroyed starfighters. Chief Technician Yorick Blackthorne supervised the operation personally, ensuring that every piece of modified equipment was documented and preserved. The F-47 Thunderhawks were gone, their frames vaporized in the antimatter cascades that had ended the battle. But their legacy would live on in the technical specifications, modification protocols, and tactical innovations that had turned obsolete equipment into instruments of victory. Chief, one of the recovery specialists called out, we're finding components that don't match any known designs. These modifications, some of them shouldn't be possible. Blackthorne smiled as he examined a piece of jury-rigged armor plating that had somehow survived the explosions intact. Son, you're looking at the difference between building something that works and building something that works when everything goes wrong. That's human engineering. But even as the galaxy marveled at humanity's technical achievements, the real story was being written in the hospital beds and memorial services of those who had made the victory possible. The names of 12 pilots were being added to humanity's roll of heroes, their actions preserved in archives that would inspire future generations of those who dared to believe that impossible was just another word for difficult. Kalen Drexus stood at the observation deck overlooking the salvage operation, his arm in a regeneration cast and his eyes focused on the distant stars. Somewhere out there, the Kythera were regrouping, studying the battle records, and learning from their defeat. They would return, eventually, with new tactics and better understanding of human capabilities. But they would find humanity changed as well. The Battle of Impossible Odds had proven that Earth's children belonged among the stars not because of their technology or their numbers, but because of something far more dangerous, their absolute refusal to accept that any fight was unwinnable. The galaxy would never underestimate humans again. And for those who might try, 12 obsolete starfighters had left a message written in fire and fury across the void. When you corner humanity, when you dismiss them as primitive and obsolete, when you assume their equipment makes them weak, that's when they become most dangerous. Because humans don't just fight with what they have. They make what they have fight better than it was ever supposed to.